Hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning. How are you? Good. Hey, my name is JP, and if you couldn't tell by the jacket, I'm the student pastor here. We are so glad that you're here, and students and kids, we are so glad that you're in the room with us this morning. We are really excited to have a family Sunday together. And speaking of that, can we give it up again for Bailey for leading us just now? Wasn't that, man? It was incredible. Also, today we're going to have some graphics you'll see on the screen, and some of those graphics are actually illustrated by a couple of our other students. So Cole Mizell and Jubilee Voller did some illustrations for us today. Can we say thank you to them as well? They did a great job. Hey, it's Family Sunday, so we're going to do something a little bit different. I need you to go with me in your imagination. We are going to go on vacation together. It's a 3-day weekend. Let's get a vacation in, but we're going to fly somewhere and go on vacation. Where should we go? Where should we go on vacation? Hawaii. Somebody said Hawaii. Believe it or not, Hawaii is what they said in the first service too. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. Let's go to Hawaii together. So, in your mind, go with me here. We've planned out our vacation. We've booked all of the things. We've packed our bags. It's the morning of our vacation. We all start to drive together in a van. It's a very large van. We're all going together to the airport. We get there with plenty of time. We make it through security, all of that stress, like it's over, and we get through. We're on the way to our gate, and something happens. You smell the Cinnabon. You smell the warm cinnamon roll out of the oven, and you've got to take a quick detour. You grab your cinnamon roll, you head to your gate, you're waiting for them to call your boarding group while you eat your cinnamon roll, and it's delicious. They finally call your boarding group. It's time to get on the plane. So you go on, you find your seat, you kind of settle in, you pull out a book to read or maybe a tablet to watch a movie, you put your headphones in, and then something else happens. This announcement comes on over the PA system that there are some safety briefing things that the flight attendants need to go through with you, and the whole plane gets silent. You guys clearly haven't flown before. That's not what happens. Nobody pays attention to that. If you're like me, you turn up the volume on your headphones, like, stop interrupting my movie. I don't know if you're with me, though. I think maybe we need to spice this up a little bit. We need a visual. We need a flight attendant this morning. Can somebody be our flight attendant? We need somebody who likes to be the center of attention all the time. Where'd Drew go? Hey, Drew, give it up for our flight attendant, Drew, this morning. Yeah, perfect. All right, so Drew's going to be our flight attendant. It's time for our safety briefing. He's getting stretched. He's getting warmed up. Lock in. Here we go. The PA system comes on, and you hear, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Northeast Air, Flight 2252 to Hawaii. Thank you for your attention while important safety information is reviewed. Please direct your attention to the flight attendant at the front of the cabin. Fasten your seatbelt by placing the metal fitting into the buckle, and adjust the strap so it fits low and tight around your hips. To release, lift the faceplate of the buckle. There are 2 door exits in the front of the aircraft, 4 window exits over the wings, and 2 door exits in the rear of the aircraft. Take a moment to locate the exit nearest you, keeping in mind that the closest exit may be located behind you. If needed, oxygen masks will be released overhead. To start the flow of oxygen, reach up and pull the mask toward you, fully extending the plastic tubing. Place the mask over your nose and mouth and slip the elastic band over your head. To tighten the fit, pull the tab on each side of the mask. The plastic bag does not need to inflate when oxygen is flowing. Be sure to secure your own mask before assisting the mask of others. A life vest is located under your seat. To use it, remove the life vest, slip it on over your head. Bro, did they not have planes in Canada or what? Did you guys just ride moose everywhere? Like what? There you go. Okay. Wrap the strap around your waist and connect them together and pull to tighten. There it is. Inflate the vest by pulling down on the red tab. The vest can be manually inflated by blowing into the end of the red tube. This vest is also equipped with a water-activated locator light that will initiate when it hits the water. It is important that you do not inflate your vest until after exiting the aircraft. Bro. As a reminder, smoking is not permitted on any flight in any area of the aircraft, including the lavatories. Tampering with, disabling, or destroying a lavatory smoke detector is prohibited. On behalf of the captain and your entire crew, it is our pleasure to welcome you aboard. Enjoy your flight. Give it up for our flight attendant this morning. Now we're going to say a prayer together that I don't get fired over that. Let's pray. Just kidding. So these announcements, right? Why does the airline put on this demonstration? Why is there this whole show that's interrupting your book or interrupting your movie as we get ready to go? I mean, nobody's paying attention anyway. We're turning on our noise-canceling headphones and trying to get to Hawaii so we can learn how to surf or faceplane in the water or whatever. Why do they do that? They're trying to be proactive, right? They're trying to keep you as safe as possible. Because even though we don't like to admit it, if we're real, there are things that could go wrong on that flight. There are bad things that could happen. There could be a bad situation where you would need some instructions on how to act in that moment. And they want to make sure you have that information. That's why they put on the whole show. If we're honest and we look around, we are in a bad situation. Our world is broken. Our culture is broken. And God has called us to act in that moment. This last week and what happened in Uvalde is just the most recent, really clear example of that. But God has called us to act. In James it says to not just be hearers of the word, but to be doers. We have to act on something. And God in His word has given us so many instructions on this, so many ways that we can act, so many ways that we can change the culture, that we can change the situation. And that starts with our families. And so we want to read together in Psalm 78 this morning. So if you have your Bible, turn to Psalm 78. If you don't have a Bible, it'll be on the screens as well. We're going to be reading verses 1 through 8 together. Psalm 78 says this: "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, but tell them to the coming generation, the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might, and the wonders that He has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God." In this psalm, the author is prepping to give a history of Israel. As if you read the rest of Psalm 78, he talks about how God redeemed His people from captivity, right? He led them out of Egypt. And unfortunately, again and again, they kept turning their backs on God. They kept rejecting Him. But again and again, God proved to be faithful. He demonstrated His power and He provided for His people. He gave them a reason to have hope. And so the author starts out this chapter by saying, before we get into all that, you need to understand that the reason we talk about these things is because we have to pass them on to the next generation. Right? He says it's not a suggestion. It's not something to do just if you have time. It is a command. In verse 5, he says, we've been commanded to do this. You may be familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 6. We're going to read 4 through 9 together. It says this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Right? As God's people, we are commanded to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength, and then to acknowledge His commandments and to diligently teach those things to the next generation. We're called to diligently point to God's truth and His character. Diligent, to do something diligent. What does that mean, right? The definition of diligent is doing something steady, with steady, earnest, and energetic effort. Steady, earnest, and energetic effort. Take a second to pause and consider, what is it in your life that you do with diligence? What are the things that you do diligently, with steady, earnest, and energetic effort? Because what we're reading here is we need to invest in the next generation. We need to disciple our students and our kids with that kind of effort. Steady, earnest, energetic effort. right? He says to do it in the morning, in the evening, when you're watching the game, when you're on the way to school. All the time, we are called to point the next generation to who God is and what he's done. We are commanded to diligently put God's truth and character on display for the next generation. We're not suggested to do that. It's not something you could do, something you're commanded to do, to point the next generation to God's truth and his character. And these two passages aren't the only place we see this in Scripture. If you look at Joshua chapter 4, God leads his people across the Jordan River. And before they move on from there, he says, hey, grab 12 big stones and set them out as a monument, so that when the children of Israel see that, you'll have an opportunity to point back to what I've done here. Right? God's saying we have to establish a conversation of faith and pointing to God and establishing hope in him with our kids. We have to point to the scoreboard of what God has already done so they can trust what he's going to do moving forward. Back to Psalm 78, we see this in verse 7. It says, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, so that they would set their hope in God. Let's think about the culture that our next generation is growing up with right now. Right? They get on Instagram or TikTok or whatever social media platform, and they're lied to. They're told that you are not enough. You have to be better. They go to school, and the desire for popularity drives them to make poor decisions just so they can get recognition, just so they can feel seen. They watch movies and TV shows and listen to music that push an agenda that's not what God has planned for them. And at times, they're even scared to be in their own classroom. This is the brokenness that our kids are experiencing. They need something to hope in. Hope is this idea that there is something better on the horizon. There's something better coming. Something that we can be confident is going to change the brokenness we're experiencing now. So we're commanded to point to God, point the next generation to him and his truth so that they can experience that hope. We have to point to the scoreboard. When you put God's truth and character on display for the next generation, you point them to the only source of real hope. Because here's the thing, as we talk about hope, as we talk about encouraging our kids to look forward to something better, there's only one thing that will last. There's only one thing that will ring true in the end. It's the fact that God loves them and will provide for them. And in the end, God has the final say. That is the hope that we get to point to. I think it's interesting to pause here too and point out the structure of this verse, right? It says, so that they would set their hope in God, and then so they would obey his commands. I think sometimes in parenting conversations or discipleship conversations with kids, we get this backwards. We have these conversations where, hey, I'm annoyed by the way you're acting, or you're embarrassing me, or whatever, and we flip that order. We say, I'm going to parent for behavior modification, or I'm going to lead a small group so that they will act a different way. And that's not how that should go. This passage is saying, so that they'll set their hope in God first. Because see, if we can do that effectively, if we can point the next generation towards hope in God, then as a result, they trust him and they trust his plan, and their behavior will change. Their motivation and their perspective will change based on what he is doing. So let's not parent out of frustration. Let's not shame our kids or our small groups. Let's point them to the hope that God has called them to, that there's something better coming. I think it's important to be clear, too. What I'm not saying that discipline isn't a part of that. Sorry, kids. Sorry, students. Discipline is a tool that God has given us to point to his hope. It's really clear in Proverbs 13:24. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to disciple him, or to discipline him. We're supposed to point to hope. And sometimes that takes a challenging conversation. Sometimes that takes discipline. Let's just make sure we're not doing that out of frustration. Let's make sure we're not shaming. Let's make sure we're pointing to hope. Back in Psalm 78, verse 8, he gives us another reason why this is so important. It says, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. Now in this passage, the author is talking about the Israelites as he's preparing to tell this history. He's talking about how they turn their back on God. But as I read this verse, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like your generation. It sounds like my generation. There's brokenness. We have turned our backs on God. We have not been steadfast to his plan. We have not been faithful. We've turned our back on him. And so our culture is broken. And if we want to see things change, then we have to act, right? We can't just be doers or just hearers. We have to be doers. We have to act on what God has called us to do. And so I would say this, if you want to see our culture change, you have to ask yourself, how are you investing in the next generation? If God has called us to do that, and if his word says that this is a benefit of that culture would look different than our culture does now, then you have to ask yourself, how are you investing in the next generation? Because that's the way that culture can change. Sometimes we get caught up in our own solutions to that. We get frustrated with the brokenness around us. We get frustrated with how the world's not following the plan that God has. And so we go to Facebook and we post something on there. That'll fix it. Or we go to coffee and we just complain to each other about how it's frustrating that things couldn't be better. We cancel people or places that don't agree with our opinion. None of that is biblical. Nowhere in the Bible does it say to cancel somebody. Nowhere does it say the solution is posting something online. It says the solution to changing our culture is teaching the next generation that there is hope in God that they need to cling to. The solution is pointing the next generation to what God has already done so that they will have confidence that he's going to act again. If you want to see our culture change, you have to ask how you are investing in the next generation. If you're ignoring this step, you're not helping. You're ignoring the flight attendant's instructions. You're not acting. We have to model obedience. We have to model confidence in the hope that God has for us. And I get this morning, there are a bunch of different groups in the room, right? Not everybody in here is a parent. And so let's talk about how that applies in some different ways. But let's start with parents because that's the clearest one. Parents, your job is to diligently disciple your kids. You are the primary discipler. God has placed those kids in your care for you to point them to him. It is your job first. And so don't think like, well, I take my kids to student men, I drop them off at kids men, I've checked that box, I'm doing what I'm called to do. That's not what Deuteronomy 6 says. Deuteronomy 6 says you're supposed to do that diligently. At breakfast, at dinner, on the way to school, during the game. Verse 9 in Deuteronomy 6 even says you should go to Hobby Lobby and get a fancy sign with a verse on it and hang it up in your house. All the time, we are supposed to be pointing our kids to the hope that is only in him. So that they would know that there's something they can count on, that there's a future that's better than what they're experiencing now. But I get that this is difficult. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, Colby and Kinsler, and I love them to death. But when I read James chapter 1 about facing trials and temptations that will test my faith, I see their picture in my head. They test my faith at times. They're probably testing the faith of some poor ECM volunteer right now. Let's be real. I get that parenting is hard. And that's why you need to know, if you're a parent in the room this morning, that you're not alone in that process. This is why the church has student ministry and kids ministry. That's why Northeast invests in our students and kids by providing programming that's specifically geared towards them. It's why our Next Gen team rallies together to come up with a plan to host events and give you conversation guides and invite you into the conversation, because we want to get behind you. You see, we believe that the best opportunity for our kids to see the hope that God has for them is for the church and the home to partner together. We believe that if the church and the home partner together, you can take the yellow, which is the light of the church, and the red, which is the heart of the home, and see where those things overlap so that our kids hear a consistent voice that points back to God and what he's doing. And so parents, know that we're behind you in that with all of those resources. Even outside of Next Gen, there's MOPS and MOPS Next, which is basically a group where moms can come together and talk about those struggles and encourage each other and point each other into a better way to do that. We've got FAST, which is a group for foster and adopt families so that you can share those struggles and you can push each other. We host parent coffee talks for parents at all phases and for parents with kids that have special needs. And life groups are such a big thing that's a part of this church. And part of that reason is because you can get in a group with people who are trying to do that together, and you can encourage each other in that work, in that ministry that God has called you to. So you're not alone in that. It is hard, but you're not alone. You are the primary discipler of your kids. I also recognize there's a group in this room of people who aren't parents. Maybe you haven't had kids yet, or you don't plan on having kids, or maybe you're in this room and you're like, hey, my kids are grown and gone, I'm done. I'm not actively parenting them in the same way anymore. This passage in Psalm 78 isn't specific to parents. If we look at verse 4 again, it says, we will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, the wonders that he has done. Nowhere in there does it say mom or dad. This is a call to God's people as a whole. As followers of God, we are commanded to invest in the next generation, no matter if you're a parent or not. There was a study done last year of all of these parents, both Christian and non-Christian, and what they found is 88% of those parents indicated that what they want for their kids is a healthy mentor. When asked, what are the things that you desire most for your kids? Healthy mentors was near the top of the list. You need to recognize this morning that this command allows you to be one of those healthy mentors. It allows you to be a voice that partners with parents at home, that reinforces the scripture that they are talking about in their houses, so that a kid knows, hey, my parent's not weird. This is actually a thing other people talk about too. Or maybe you can be the voice for a kid that doesn't have that voice at home. Maybe you can invest in the life of a student whose parents are not following God and they're not pointing him to that hope. You can step into that. We've been challenged to do this because it matters. Time and time again, I've heard stories of how volunteer small group leaders have positively affected the lives of students and kids. Just through consistent discipleship, through consistently pointing to who God is, you can change lives. And not only that, but you can change the lives of entire families. Right? We've seen so many stories of not only students and kids being discipled, but as a result of that, their families feeling ministered to and their families being invited to church. And so don't let your age or your gifting slow you down. You've been commanded to step into that role. You can be that voice. There's one more group in the room, though, that we haven't addressed. Kids and students, where are you at? They're falling asleep. That's okay, though. Here's the deal. I understand in this conversation, as we look at how parents and volunteers should invest in you, they can be easy to tune out. I'm asking you to tune back in here for a second, because this passage applies to you too. Because if our parents and our adults are called to invest in you, then you have a job to listen. Your job is to listen, to understand that when your parents wake you up early and drag you to church, or discipline you, or a small group leader challenges you to think about something in a different way, you don't roll your eyes and sigh. In fact, you recognize that they're doing that because they love you. And God told them they have to do it. In Proverbs chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, it says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck." A garland for your head and a pendant for your neck. What does that mean? Well, a garland was like a crown that they would give somebody, and think of a pendant like a necklace or a medal. And so these things would be given to somebody to show honor, to show recognition. If they won a race, or maybe they were given a position of power, they would give them these things to recognize that. And so what Proverbs says is when your parents discipline you, when they challenge you so that you'll see hope in God, they're not trying to annoy you. They're trying to honor you. That's something you should be grateful for. It's something you should lean into. And not only that, but there's another application for you. Other than just listening and understanding that truth, your other application is you've got to tell people. You've got to repeat it. Because if our passing on of what God has done, if that's going to affect our culture, that means you have to take it to that culture. you have to affect the next generation too. With your classmates and your teammates and your friends, you have to point to that same hope that you're hearing about at home and in the church. You're not left out of that. And we need you to hear this morning that you are valuable. Kids and students in the room, we value you so much. You're precious to us, and you're precious in the sight of God, and He has plans for you to do incredible things. And His hope will not fail. He will continue to act. So we're challenging to set your hope in that. So what does this actually look like? We've covered that there's this action we've been called to. We've covered that there are different groups and different ways to apply that. But what does it actually look like? Because it sounds complicated. I would argue that it's pretty simple. Think of it like this. Pursue God in a way that challenges others to pursue Him with you. If you want to invest in the next generation, if you want to diligently disciple the next generation or your friends and classmates around you, pursue Jesus in a way that challenges them to pursue Him with you. That's all you have to do is chase after Him. You don't have to be a Bible scholar. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have all of the answers. You just need to chase after God and what He's doing so that other people can see that. And sometimes those are just little moments, little opportunities that you have to point back to Him. I remember when I was learning to drive, I was 15, we did like the parent-taught driver's ed, where somebody either learns to drive or dies. It's one of those things. And I remember we were driving to church one time, and my dad was sitting in the passenger seat, and I needed to change lanes. And so as we were approaching this intersection, I changed lanes in the middle of the intersection. My dad didn't say a word, but he reached over and he pinched the back of my arm right here. You know, like if somebody pinches you there, like you want to just react with punching or whatever. Like, what did I ever do to you? And I freaked out, like, what are you doing? Like, I'm trying to drive, that hurt. He said, you can't do that. What, can't do what? You just pinched my arm, what are you talking about? You can't change lanes in the middle of the intersection. I was like, okay, whatever. I got it, I guess. But I tell you, to this day, if I need to change lanes and I'm approaching an intersection, there's like this tingling sensation in the back of my arm. And I know I'm not supposed to do that. That is a moment that stuck. It was a little thing, but it stuck. Right? It was a little opportunity to teach me something that has stuck with me. In Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child in the ways that they should go when they're young, and when they're old, they will not depart from that. If you can diligently disciple our kids now, they won't depart from that when they're old. And here's why. Because if you're diligently pursuing Christ yourself, they will see that in you. And before you are known as mom or dad or small group leader, they will see follower of Christ. And that sticks. That's something that can't be ignored. So all you have to do is pursue Him and let them see that pursuit in you. But maybe you're in this room and you're like, man, that still sounds too challenging. That still sounds intimidating. I don't think I could do that. Or maybe you're sitting in this room and you're like, hey, I took my kids to church when they were young, and I'm not seeing the fruit of that promise now. They're not walking with Him now. Then the truth that you need to hear this morning is only God can change those hearts. And we have to practice what we preach. If we're saying, students, kids, you need to set your hope in God because He has a plan and it's better, then we have to believe that for ourselves, for our own kids. We have to trust in that same plan. The truth is, my parents were incredible, and they still are incredible. They continue to point me to who God is. They continue to point me to His plan and His hope. They are not the primary reason I'm following Jesus. Jim Loki was my student pastor, and he is a mentor still. He's invested in me in so many ways. He's not the reason I'm following God. I'm pursuing Jesus because He did a work in my heart that nobody else could do. God is the only one that can fix the brokenness. He's the only one that can really provide that hope. So our job is just to point to that and to trust Him with the rest. We have to diligently disciple our next generation so that they will set their hope in God. And that will change our culture. It will change their hearts because God will do that work. Drew said last week, it's not on you. God is able. God will do that work. So we have to trust that. At the same time, though, it would be weird if you were on a plane where something was going bad and you didn't do anything. You just sat there and kind of hoped, like, well, hope this gets better. That wouldn't make any sense. You're called to act in that moment. God's given us the instruction to act on. He said, pour into the next generation. So you have to do that. We talked about our mobile site this morning. You can go onto the mobile site, you can click the serve button, and you can get plugged in as a small group leader. We talked about Take 5. You can go out into the lobby and see Randy and sign up to take a few weeks this summer to do that. We're all commanded to invest in that way. Plus, if you sign up for Take 5, you might get some free goldfish. That's a good deal. We are all commanded to invest in the next generation so that they will set their hope in God. Don't miss that this morning. Will you pray with me? God, we are grateful that you invite us into the work that you're doing. God, we are grateful for our students and our kids in the room this morning and those that aren't. And God, we know that you have big plans for them, to use them in huge ways to shift our culture back to you. So God, I pray that we would be obedient, that we wouldn't just be hearers, but that we would doers, that we would act on this commandment that you've given us to diligently disciple the next generation. And God, I pray after that we would practice what we're preaching, God, that we would set our hope in you, that we would trust you to do that work, because only you can. So God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for loving us enough to give us a plan. And God, we trust you with the rest. Amen.